nhớ rằng trong phương như mọi chùa số lên sự tưởng là nó của Yahweh này cả rằng xe đã tạo tân trí nè nhớ là sự hóa sự cho nó nói vậy nó và chán tôi đi lý nó là nó đã cố nó đi cái năm mòn được tức là snow là và cái xe tại đây một cái tên là có nên ở tí trong trả chế thế cả số lên sự tưởng trí cái nó cá như trong đầu đuôi trong xe nó sẽ nó của lần trí này là của là hãy ra đến năng và cũng mất sâu kêu kia là gì đâu bé ra đến năng nói mất sâu cháu phì đâu từ viên dạo Aashly Maiv Paj Santiago và chờ với các chuyện kia của sĩ Colombia đó ra đến năng là thế nó nói giờ tại nên sĩ mà đã chỉ ta cậu nên là lần đó cũng lòng ra đến năng là sẽ có một cái cả ra đến năng là cái giờ tồn ý nè tồn ó mà lý tờ tận tay nó mà
I wanna be a weekend lover. Yeah, I'ma be the best damn lover you got. I wanna mess up your covers. You love, you love, you love. I don't wanna meet your mother. Never ever ask me how I've been. Remember why you have my number. You love, you love, you love. I'm the best thing that has ever happened to you. Here's your time to shine. Now show me what you can do. My hands feel on your body. The way we're dancing in the dark. With every move I make, you're falling.
The early morning sun rose from the horizons, and Maiv Paj stirred, feeling around for the hair clip she kept underneath her pillow. She sat up, pulled her long dark hair into a bun, and got out of bed. She dressed and walked outside to welcome the sun as she gathered a bowl of water to wash her face. In the village of Daydao, she was one of the older single daughters. Her sisters had all married, and she was labeled as Itun Golong. It wasn't that she didn't have anyone, she did, but she was kind of picky when it came upon the man to own her heart. She hadn't seen anyone who was good enough to earn the title as her husband. Maiv Paj had a sweet personality with rosy cheeks and a natural beauty that had many clinging onto her. Once she became a friend, it would be for a long time. Her parents had doted on her hand and foot since she had been the first child. But as the younger siblings came, they learned to balance, and she learned to live life on her own terms. She finished washing her face and gathered up the bucket to feed the chickens. Then she grabbed the bamboo basket and saw her mother gathering together some fire from their shed to start breakfast. Maiv Paj said. Her mother, Na, looked up from where she was busy, poking the wood together to start a fire. Her mother's silvering hair worried Maiv Paj over the years, and although her mother was strong, she knew that one day she wouldn't always be this way. Guchi no chaila Maiv Paj? Her mother asked. Guchi chaya? Ipliha ku muate ku la chene ke ku malino, e kusine gachi no onde. She turned and started walking toward the path that led to their garden. The world was just awakening, and life was finally taking shape and form. She saw little children running out of the thatched houses, half naked, ready to play outside. She made her way to her friend Paku's house and saw her friend feeding the pigs. Paku was a slender woman with long, thick black hair that she always had in a braid. She was the youngest and only daughter, so she was a bit spoiled, but she had a good heart. Paku, Maiv Paj said as she stopped by the homemade fence Paku's father put up. Paku looked up and set the bucket down. Oh, Maiv Paj ka lo? Ka mo da china? Kui mua tế sao? Câu của lúa ở mùa gió. Tao mà, tao cũng có nông kia, cũng mua cỡ cho mà to. The two friends began walking down the dirt path, each one carrying a basket on their back, their laughter and voices chattering as the sun began to rise higher in the sky. Up ahead, two young men were coming down the hill carrying the day's morning kill. They were two men from the village where Maiv Paj and Paku were from. The two men were also known as cheaters and abusers. They were married with a house full of children, yet they snuck out at night to wander around the village to break maidenhoods. The two friends stopped and looked for another route to take, but it was too late, for they were already seen. Lungo! One of them shouted as they ran down the hill. His name was Tai, the middle son of one of the villagers who knew Maiv Paj's father very well. He was taller than the other one, whose name was Feng. Tai had 5 children, and Feng's wife was at home expecting their 7th child. The two men were careless and devils who wanted to charm their way into woman's bed, but left before the sun rose. Name what china? Cái yung cô lo le lúcนู้นเนี่ยขอเต๋อเซ่จะเสียมป้ามูน่ะเดี๋ยวนี้มือเทียบกับเต๋อ Tai asked as he circled around them. Cái từ bên địa tao có cái chiếc một trái trái bề kề nó móc cà phê thì cái học cô cũng chỉ lo nè. Maiv Paj said. Ty laughed and covered his heart with his hand. Oh, lòng cao ơi, chả giờ hai tao lú tao bỏ luôn liò, chọn gấu lú tê xếp tao tao liền nè. Chả tứ rong gì nhẹ thế, chả hai lú yếu chỉ cái luôn trên mồ liò, lòng cao ơi, hai lú rong gì thế mà. My pa ignored him as Phong came down the hill and joined them. He reached out to touch Baku's hand, and the two friends jumped back. My pa reached into her basket and pulled out her rice blade. Sao đấy chọn gì nấy tụi tê nè? Ty smiled, and a wicked emotion flickered across his face. Ôi rong trả lời nữa kìa, lão của tụi này giàu lắm mà. Cứ sự hào chuồn rồi nhỉ? My pa declared. Ty and Phong laughed, and then they walked off together as Baku reached over to hold my pa's hand. She noticed that Baku's hand was shaking. Cơ bố chả na Baku, chỉ có cái chén nữa lo, my pa asked. Baku shook her head and took a deep breath. Cô mà cũng chú anh đã chấp lỡ liệu. Chả anh có anh bên này yếu trổ luôn, chỉ khiếu có pha nè. My pa made a face and replied, Cơ yếu chả bảo tiền, có tư kiếp chứ sao lần nè. Chê tư kia trổ ta lệ, ôi tao lệ chạy thì lệ ôi xe nhỏ sợ. The two continued walking down the path until they reached my pa's family garden. They went to work and gardened up until the sun rose high in the sky, indicating that it was afternoon. They decided to call it a day and packed to come home. On the way home, my pa brought up the subject of marriage. Baku, cú nó cú nè ta thà hay tia lúc thì tận tay nói, cứ nè tụi đá lô tụi tú, giờ tôi hay con này bố mất tiền lên đó nọ. Baku fell silent and then she stopped walking. She came to sit down on a rock beside the road. Yoko. My pa joined her friend and reached over to push her hair from her face. Ê, có bao nhiêu có đá lô tụi tú mà? Looking up with teary eyes, Baku answered. Cú thích tao bỏ đôi, cú yếu chả nhiều nữa nè. Cú trái ple nữa làm một về cú cơ tá sọ. Cú yếu lý chả nọ. My pa reached over and touched her friend's arm. Sao sao lý có mà, tại sao nữ cô rong trái rong mà thế à? Tôi ở rong bộ liên tớ, ôi chả chúng mô bà nè, họ chẳng tuần cây trái hay cú nữa mà. My pa laughed and then she placed her hands on her chin, looking up at her friend. Trái ple ta sai, nữ tí tôi rong thôn gì hay, thằng đó có yếu lý chả nọ. Baku laughed. Chú à, giờ cũng mong mong chơi rong sơ mà. Trái chỉ yếu liên tớ chơi, cú cơ qua cũng muốn chỉ lò. Ê con này, nữ bây giờ tôi yếu sao? Có yếu tỏ thứ thư có bà lên mùi yếu gì nè? My pa made a face. Cú chỉ yếu. Có chỉ yếu? Baku asked in shock. Ê có yếu đó cái này cái gì nhỏ ấy, có sao tổ cơ lo? Shrugging, my pa stood up and replied. Tôi chỉ mong tôi rong gì của xe nè. Tôi lo xe kề, riêng nhau, tôi rong ra rong mơ kề cây tao. Sai gì mà sai nhung tôi tiền liệu Baku. Baku stood up and laughed, taking her friend's arm. Sao sẽ sai chả có bờ à? Cú bờ chê, cú cơ tôi có thấy tôi mới nhớ sớm mà.
You sing out your frustration. Just say a word. Keep on staring at the pavement. God knows who hurt. Ooh, your mind is a ghost town, echoing inside your walls, 5 feet underground now.
As the evening sky turned a deep orange, my pa came outside to sit with her pandao as usual. This was her routine every single day. Garden and return home to help with her parents, and then pandao during the evening. Her birthday was coming up, and she would be 25. Her parents had been pushing for marriage for 2 years now, but she'd lost the heart to tell her parents that she may never marry. No one had touched her heart the way she wanted. Her parents were getting older, so she wanted to care for them instead. She heard a sound, and her mother came out to join her. Có xin keng làm mai pa? Her mother asked. She smiled and replied, Xin keng hơn ya, cô chỉ bự lo. Lao, có chỉ một chỗ sao tỏ lo lỡ. She looked at her mother getting the needle ready to work. Nia, pa cô đau tụi tú, yếu tôi ngay chơi hai nữa tới lo. Her mother looked at her and nodded. Tôi là mà, nói ý pa cô nia tới thả lên đó cô. Cũng do lòng đi của tôi hai đứa có lỡ sao? Ya mà nia, có ý hay lỡ mà. Có sao lấy giá sao? Sao khỏi lúc tới tôi ngay chơi hai nè. Her mother put her pan down and asked, ôi nhà con nông nè, con mới thứ lo. Chị mua nè, cô chưa sao bao sao? Ai à, ngày chơi hai kê, tôi có muốn chơi một sao, mình sai ơ. Thấu cô tôi trời có gì xí này là tôi xí lúc cha của cho nè lùa, lúc tôi ngày chơi hai à. Giờ ý tôi lùa này nhà con thế lúc có thể tiền lại kê, chị ta yếu tôi ngày chơi hai liệu. Ở lần xí lũ lại kê, ở lần xí sâu sao mà mình sai. My pa reached over and picked up her mother's hand. Nè, có bất kỳ đó cô, giờ hai tia, cô chỉ yếu gì muốn ta cô xin nâng nó. Her mother playfully slapped her shoulders. Chủ kìa, cháu hại đi con á. Nú tư con chỉ cả tụi chị cũng chỉ bút cái vô là cái nhiều kia mùi vô sợ mà mãi ba ở.
I wanna be a weekend lover. Yeah, I'ma be the best damn lover you got. I wanna mess up your covers. You love, you love, you love. I don't wanna meet your mother. Never ever ask me how I've been. Remember why you have my number.
The alarm ringing beside him jolted Landon awake, and he reached over, turning it off. Another restless night, a night of tossing and turning, nightmares that chased him until he was breathless. 30 years of this, and he was sure he would die young if he didn't find a way to settle this in. He cleared his throat and swung his legs out of bed, standing to shower and begin his day. Landon hadn't ever thought he'd be in this situation. He was young, successful, and the most eligible bachelor, yet he was overworked, tired, and unhappy. He stood underneath the water and let it run down his back, taking away the awful nightmares that seemed to take hold of his heart and soul. His grandparents had tried everything they could to help him relieve of it, but no matter what they did, it didn't seem to help. Therapy was a waste of money because it wasn't doing anything he had already done before. The nightmares of his parents' death had chased him into his 30s, and it had gotten worse. Reliving the bullets that surrounded them as they ran from Laos to the Mekong River, and him, a young child on his mother's back as they ran for life. The sound of his father's bloody gurgle as he took his last breath and as his mom and him ran. He remembered turning to see his father looking at them with his eyes rolling in the back of his head. Shit, he said as he pounded the wall. And then the sadness filled him, and he began to cry. It had been a long time since he truly cried for the loss of his parents, and today, of all days, the feeling consumed him, and he let it out. He began screaming in the shower, slamming his hands against the wall, and soon the slamming turned into punches, and he fell slowly to the ground as the water washed over his bloody knuckles. His grandmother Jo asked as they ate congee together at the table for breakfast. His grandmother was still young and lively as she sat wearing a black dress with her hair in a tight bun. Landon replied. His grandma put the spoon down and looked at him. He ignored the question. Mito, she said, willing him to look at her. Her tone of voice had no room to argue. Landon looked up at her. Mito, they came bo Chopin. Ya có dối từ nhà là cũng có lúc xa chạy plot là sớm. He took a drink of warm tea and stood up, putting his suit jacket on. During his day at the office, he was going through the latest documents when his secretary, Mia, walked in. Mia was tall, slender, and had bright red hair. She was wearing a short gray dress, one that he didn't quite like. He'd have to remind her not to wear that again. His grandparents were trailing behind her. He stood up as Mia walked out, closing the door. His grandfather, Cheng, took a seat, and his grandmother sat beside him. His grandfather was still strong as an ox, and he was taller than most men that Landon knew. His grandfather pulled out a photo and slid it across the table to him as Landon sat down in his chair. The photo was of a young girl with flowing black hair and a natural beauty that tugged at his heart. He wasn't sure why he was feeling this way just looking at this photo. His grandfather replied, Landon laughed and shoved the photo back to his grandfather. And then he stopped looking. Landon laughed even harder. His grandmother said. Nate thought she piece Shaking his head, he replied, "Ba, Gucci you are. Tielo to na. They to put the ban only got Gucci chana. Sata ma tolo te mi to Cha I play ke, nu tu chica you con na. John Jong hai tia. Nu tero ya to ya pa to kaluneng sha. Cha hai le chin dao. Ya có một lần gọi là chè cú yên chỉ yo gọi là mà. Để chỉ gọi là pin ở bên xe thế cái kia cú sai. Lulu lì cái bây giờ một sai nữa nè.
Won't you sing out your frustration? Just say a word. Keep on staring at the pavement. God knows who hurt.
Landon finished drinking, and Jason poured him another one, and he downed it like it didn't burn his throat. He couldn't believe it. How could his grandparents do this to him? Jason was smiling as he sat beside him, nursing his drink. Jason was a handsome man with dark hair and a smile that attracted almost everyone. He was a well-known douchebag, and although that bothered Landon, he knew that deep down somewhere there has to be some good left in the man. Jason said as he gave him a dark glare. Jason smiled. Landon rolled his eyes and leaned forward. Jason burped and looked away as Landon smiled.
Would you stay till the morning light? Or would you follow me? Or would you let it be? If I leave tonight, we could do this right. We'll find the remedy. Or would you stay with me now till the morning light? Before you turn away.
Maiv Paj and Baku were walking down the dirt path home when little children were running past them toward the direction of her house. The two of them looked at each other in confusion, and she stopped one of the children. The little boy replied happily, The boy ran off as the two friends looked at each other. When they reached Maiv Paj's house, there was a crowd that had formed. She had never seen such a crowd like this before in her life. When she pushed her way through, she saw an older man handing out little bags of candies. A little girl came through the crowd and pushed Maiv Paj forward and into the arms of someone. When she looked up, she realized someone had caught her before she hit the ground. The man before her was young, handsome, and exotic. The look in his eyes was nothing but purity and good intentions. He was dressed in a white t-shirt and jeans that made him look so seductive. He was holding her in his arms, and she quickly pulled herself away as Baku helped her. "Tatsiao," she said as she walked around the crowd and into her home. Her mother was washing a chicken, and another older woman wearing a black shirt with a green skirt was sitting beside her mother, talking quietly. "Nia," Maiv Paj said as she removed her basket and set it aside. "Nia, yo li jiao." Her mother stood up, and so did the woman. "Oh, mi zai, ka la la la. Mi Baku, ka to la." Baku smiled. Pa ku to." Her mother reached over and touched the arm of the woman standing beside her. "Mi Maiv Paj, tu nói ne tai sa chang a. Maiv Paj smiled gently as the woman known as her Thai opened her arms, and Maiv Paj walked to give her a hug. She ran her hands over Maiv Paj's hair and smiled. "Min Thai, ka jung ko lo li a. O chao, ne to sa tu la na. Ne ko to sa lu na sa." "Maiv Paj," Baku said as she came forward. "Guya mu chao. Mi Baku, da pe na mo chama," Maiv Paj's mother said. Baku smiled. "Tao lo apao, ku chang ye mo mo te ku mo la. Maiv Paj ka pasa ku ya." Maiv Paj smiled at the two older women and walked with her friend out the door. Once they were out of earshot, Baku whispered into Maiv Paj's ear. "Ôi chang trả lời tôi nghĩ cho hay có. Nhớ nhớ tên nâng giật giàu lên tới yêu cho bao đùa là tôi lên mà ý không có chỉ được sức nè." Maiv Paj felt her heart shudder. "Cứ chỉ tao sát sang đi có à. Tự tiền à, cứ ở tí trong sai sư mà. Cũng muốn chạy rồi nè. Ta kỳ ư mà cái thả đùa. Ô liò, muốn có to." As Baku walked home, Maiv Paj turned and tripped over her feet, causing her to fall forward only to be caught again by the same young man as before. This time, when he caught her, he lost his balance and the two of them fell together. As she fell, she landed on top and their lips brushed against each other. Gasping, she stood up as Landon stood and brushed the dirt from his shirt. Landon asked. She laughed. Feeling angry, she walked around him and into the house where the crowd outside had disappeared. Her father was sitting together with an older man, the one who had been handing out candies. Maiv Paj, Landon. Maiv Paj turned to find the young man walking in to sit beside his grandpa. Maiv Paj said. The grandfather asked. Maiv Paj smiled. And then the young man smiled and said, I
wanna be a weekend lover. Yeah, I'ma be the best damn lover you got. I wanna mess up your covers.